9. Schoolboy versus Rock Python. One day in 2002, while children played outside their school in Durban, South Africa, a 20-foot-long rock python made its way onto the property and set its sights on an innocent 10-year-old boy. It began wrapping itself around him, pinning the young student's arms to his side. In the meantime, the victim's terrified classmates scrambled up into some nearby mango trees and looked on in horror as the snake suffocated their friend. The python squeezed harder and harder until the boy's eyes closed and his head dropped back. Once he was dead, the hungry reptile ate the child. It took around 3 hours for the snake to swallow its victim whole. The other kids remained perched on tree branches the entire time, too paralyzed with fear to come down. Finally, the python slithered off toward a nearby stream, leaving no trace of the boy behind. This tragedy marked the first known case of a rock python eating a human. So what inspired the creature to act out of character? According to local snake expert Craig Smith, who spoke with the Sydney Morning Herald, the snake had probably recently come out of hibernation with an unusually large appetite. Locals searched for the offending python but never found it. Can you imagine how traumatized the other kids must be from witnessing something like that? 8. Leeanne Mir. In 2014, an Australian woman named Leeanne Mir received an alarming warning from Daniel Natush, a scientist who told her that a dangerous snake had been spotted lurking near her home on the Cape York Peninsula. Natush and his colleagues had recently put a tracking device on the 12-foot-long Australian scrub python, but they couldn't remove it from the area because it was hiding beneath a shipping container. The species is generally not considered a threat to adults, but it's known to go after pets and small children. Concerned for the well-being of Leanne's kids, who were 1 and 3 years old at the time, Natush advised her to keep her windows and doors shut. Mears cracked her door open for some air just days later, during a heat wave. She kept an eye on it the best she could and closed it before going to bed, not realizing that the snake had slithered into the house. In the early morning hours, it made its way into Leanne's bed, bit her, and began coiling itself around her leg. She awoke to find the snake attached to her body, sinking its teeth into her rear end. Ouch! Leeanne reached her fingers into the reptile's mouth and forced it open, freeing herself from its bite. Thankfully, she managed to uncoil the python without any serious injuries. But this wasn't the end of the story. The snake returned to Leanne's house a year later and attacked her dog. The dog lost consciousness, but thankfully it survived. The researchers who had warned the family explained in a study that even though the snake had tried to eat its victims, it would never have succeeded because it was too small. But that doesn't make the thought of waking up to a python in your bed any less scary, does it? 7. Paul Roli. In late 2014, the Discovery Channel began airing previews for a documentary called Eaten Alive, promising viewers that they would get to see a man enter the belly of an anaconda. That man is naturalist Paul Roli, and his plan was to let a snake swallow him up to his waist. He put on a special suit and helmet, covered himself in pig's blood, and antagonized an 18-foot-long anaconda until she attacked him. The snake tried to swallow Roli's head and coiled herself around his body for over an hour. She had him pinned face down in the mud under her crushing weight, and he progressively grew weaker. Roli's heart rate began to slow down, and he felt his arm being crushed. Knowing he would be seriously injured if the encounter continued, he called for rescue. Viewers felt deceived by the show's promotions, and animal rights activists accused its creators of cruelty against the snake. Roli and the Discovery Channel claim that they made the special to raise awareness about endangered wildlife in the Amazon. But many people did not see this as an excuse to provoke a wild animal. Meanwhile, Roli reportedly suffered minor injuries but told Entertainment Weekly that it took him months to recover from the ordeal. What do you think about Roli being swallowed by the snake? Did he deceive viewers? Was that fair to the snake? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. 6. Kelvin Kataka. A Zambian truck driver named Kelvin Kataka told the press that he was lucky to be alive after a python attacked him on the job in 2013. Kataka didn't notice the snake in his vehicle before it struck him from out of nowhere while he was driving at a copper mine. The python lunged at the unsuspecting man and began coiling itself around his body, according to Kataka, who spoke with AFP from his hospital bed. A lengthy struggle ensued, and Kataka did everything he could to get the snake off him. He even bit the python before taking a knife out of his pocket and stabbing it several times. I think I would have grabbed the knife before biting the snake. The snake began to loosen itself, but soon enough it once again tightened its grip on the man. Kataka began vomiting blood and fainted. Two of his co-workers discovered the horror and killed the snake. They took Kataka to the hospital, where he spent over a month recovering. If it hadn't been for his quick-thinking colleagues, he may have been the creature's next meal. 5. Noah and Connor Barthay. In 2013, two little boys named Noah and Connor Barthay went to a sleepover at their friend's apartment in New Brunswick, Canada. At some point during the night, a large African rock python escaped from its cage and entered an air duct. The vent collapsed under the 14-foot-long, 100-pound creature's weight, and the snake fell directly onto the 4- and 6-year-old brothers. Jean-Claude Savoy, the father of the friend the boys were visiting, discovered their dead bodies and called 911. By the time police got there, it was too late to save the brothers, who were covered in blood and puncture wounds. An autopsy showed that they died from asphyxiation, and Savoy was charged with criminal negligence. Constable Stéphane Dugas, who had reported to the scene, testified that the snake made growling noises and lunged at the glass of its enclosure after Savoy returned it to its cage. The reptile was clearly agitated, leaving one to wonder if it might have eaten the boys given the chance. Prosecutors claim that the rock python had a history of escaping and aggressive behavior, and Savoy did not have a proper license to own it. They accused him of failing to take proper precautions to prevent a tragedy from happening. The allegations went even deeper when the possibility of foul play was brought up. Experts testified that it was rare for a rock python to act so aggressively, and that these creatures don't just go on killing sprees. Savoy's lawyer argued that the man thought his pet python was too large to fit into the air duct, and therefore saw no reason to secure it, even though it was accessible from the snake's cage. Speaking with CBS News, snake expert John Kendrick explained that a startled python will grab onto anything nearby for stability, and that in this case, it might have been the boys that it landed on. Savoy was ultimately found innocent. 4. Heng Chuan. One night in 1995, a 29-year-old rubber plantation worker named Heng Chuan went outside to turn off a water pump at his home in Penang, Malaysia. He was attacked by a python, and his brother called police to the scene. By the time they arrived, the man was dead. The snake had already swallowed his head and crushed some of his bones. Police shot and killed the massive reptile. Measuring 23 feet long, it was the longest python ever seen in Malaysia, according to zoologist Q Bong Heng, who spoke with the Associated Press. He said it was the first time a python had attacked a human in Malaysia, which means it was also the first time a python tried to swallow a person in the country. District Police Chief Mohammed Mokhtar Ahmed told the news agency that the python was 10 inches in diameter and weighed 308 pounds. Sadly, a human is no match for a snake of this size. By the time the victim crossed paths with it, he was more or less doomed. 3. Eric Arrieta. A student zookeeper made a fatal mistake in 2008 by letting a Burmese python out of its enclosure at the Caracas Zoo in Venezuela. Biology student Eric Arrieta was working the night shift alone when he decided to break the zoo's rules and free the serpent, which had only been at the zoo for 2 months. The 10-foot-long snake bit the 19-year-old's hand and crushed him to death. It was too late to save Arrieta by the time employees discovered the python with his head in its mouth. It was trying to swallow Arrieta, whose co-workers beat the reptile until it released its grip on his remains. It's not in a python's nature to attack a human, but it certainly can and sometimes does happen, especially when one feels threatened or perhaps has an unusually big appetite. Pythons aren't venomous, but they're massively strong. In addition to being able to easily asphyxiate their victims, they're capable of causing other serious injuries that sometimes even require stitches, if the person is lucky enough to survive. Only Arrieta knew why he foolishly broke the zoo's policies and entered the snake's cage, and he took his reasons to the grave. But he clearly underestimated the creature's strength, and his needless and tragic death is a reminder of why the zoo had a rule against doing what he did. 2. Anaconda Deathgrip. An 8-year-old boy named Mateus came terrifyingly close to death while playing near a creek outside his grandfather's ranch in Cosmorama, Brazil in 2007. An anaconda took the boy to the ground and began wrapping itself around him. Mateus started to suffocate, and his friends rushed for help. The boy's 66-year-old grandfather, Joaquim Pereira, beat the snake with rocks and stabbed it with a knife in a desperate attempt to save the boy's life. It took the man a half hour to uncoil the anaconda from Mateus's body. Thankfully, Pereira acted in the nick of time, and Mateus survived with 21 stitches to his chest. Anacondas and pythons rarely attack humans, but they can easily kill one within minutes. These unforgiving reptiles are known to target pets and small children more often than they go after adults. In 2016, an Australian mother named Tamara Thurgood awoke to find a python coiled around her 6-year-old son Tyler's stomach. The snake had already bitten the little boy in the face several times when Thurgood began fighting to free him. 2 relatives reported to the scene and killed the python. Miraculously, Tyler did not recall being bitten by the snake, and he had his eyes closed during the attack, according to Thurgood. Not only did she discover the encounter in time to save Tyler's life, he was evidently spared from the trauma of remembering the horrifying ordeal. 1. Anaporn Boon Makchui. While using the toilet at his home outside Bangkok, Thailand in 2016, a man named Anaporn Boon Makchui felt something jump up and bite him in his nether region. A 10-foot-long python had slithered its way through the plumbing and clamped its jaws down on his privates. The unfortunate victim spent a half hour trying to get the snake to release its grip. Finally, with help from his wife and a neighbor, he pried the serpent's jaws open, freed himself, and fainted. Emergency responders found the bathroom covered in blood. The snake was removed from the toilet and released back into the wild. Meanwhile, Anaporn was taken to the hospital, where doctors told him he would recover. He was happy enough about this to smile while giving interviews from his hospital bed. Hospital director Dr. Chutima Picharon commended the man's positive attitude, even though his wife and children were shocked. I guess it makes sense that knowing he was going to emerge from the incident with his privates intact was enough to make the man happy.
Number 10. The Hollywood Ripper. Michael Gargiulo is the Hollywood Ripper. Judge Larry P. Fidler from Los Angeles, California, called his crimes vicious and frightening when giving out the sentence for his terrible crime spree. The judge sentenced Gargiulo to death. He also said that everywhere Michael went, the death and destruction followed. Michael had a lot of jobs in his life. He was a bouncer for a while. He did some time as an air conditioning repairman, and he was an aspiring actor. But he also worked as a killer. He murdered Tracy Pacasio in 1993, Ashlyn Ellerin in 2001, Maria Bruno in 2005, and he tried to murder a woman in Santa Monica in 2008. Back in 2001, Ashley Ellerin was actually pen pals with the famous actor Ashton Kutcher. She was due to go on a date with the actor when she was discovered in her Hollywood home with 47 stab wounds. Kutcher had gone to her house in the hills and knocked at her door, but she never answered. He simply thought he'd been stood up, but in fact, she was lying dead inside at the hands of Michael Gargiulo. Why did Michael go on a random kill spree from 1993 to 2008? There's not really a good answer to this question. He targeted young and attractive women, and he brutalized them for no other reason than he wanted to. Number 9. The Golden State Killer. The Golden State Killer went on a crime spree that lasted a decade. The spree was something out of a nightmare, who then used his knowledge of police work in the judicial system to get away with 13 murders and dozens of assaults through the 1970s and 1980s. His real name is Joseph James DeAngelo Jr., 74 years old, when he was finally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But some might say it was too little too late. He wasn't arrested until 2018, 3 decades after he stopped murdering. The guy had 3 adult daughters at the time, and a whole stable of grandchildren. He was considered the harmless grandfather, and yet he had a darker past than anyone in his family could have imagined. Like many killers from the 70s and 80s who were recently caught, James was tracked down and arrested because of DNA matches. We know that he began killing in 1975 in the Sacramento area. After his first few kills, he spread into the rest of the state and struck wherever he saw fit. But his spree ended as quickly as it started in 1986 when he murdered an 18-year-old girl. As quickly as the hunger had taken him over, it left him. He stopped killing and settled down. He was still a monster. Number 8. 4 decades of murder. Samuel Little spent 4 decades murdering. When he was finally apprehended, he confessed to committing 93 homicides. Through his confession, police were able to confirm at least 50 of them. That makes him the most prolific serial killer in the United States of America. And yet, nobody knows the guy's name. If you were to say Samuel Little, most people wouldn't bat an eye. Yet they know the names of dozens of other serial killers who are notorious, with way fewer murderers under their belts. Samuel began killing in 1971. He met a woman at a bar in North Miami, and something just came over him. After he murdered the woman, he realized he liked it. He then began targeting prostitutes and runaway teenagers, or women who had difficulties with drugs or alcohol. Most of these women were already missing people when they encountered Samuel Little, exiled from society. They weren't entirely missed. When a woman disappeared from a street corner in the 1970s, it didn't make national news. This wasn't like Ted Bundy, who went after young college students and professionals. This was ultimately what made Ted Bundy far more notorious and what got him caught in the end. It wasn't until recently that DNA evidence finally connected Samuel to several unexplained deaths. One of the killings had even been pinned on a carnival worker named Jerry Frank Townsend in 1979. He spent 22 years in prison before DNA evidence shifted the blame onto Samuel. Number 7. Green River Killer. Gary Ridgway, aka the Green River Killer, is without a doubt the most famous man that we've talked about today. He himself claimed to have murdered at least 80 women, maybe even more. He killed them in the Seattle, Washington area. When he was finally convicted in 2003, He pleaded guilty to 48 counts of murder. He even spread out over a 20-year span. This is a lot of murder. Gary needed to kill around 3 people a year, and to do it all without ever getting caught. He was methodical in his killing, strangling woman after woman and dumping their corpses in a random place to confuse the authorities. He never kept any trophies, he never told anyone what he was doing, and he never showed any signs of being a psychopath at the truck plant where he worked. He was also married 3 times, and none of his wives knew what he was up to in his spare time. The killings began in 1982 when a group of kids found the strangled corpse of Wendy Caulfield floating in the Green River. Over the next few weeks, 4 more bodies washed up on the river's banks. All of them were women, and all of them had been strangled. And here's what's really infuriating. Gary Ridgway was a suspect in 1983 following the death of Marie Malvar. Police questioned Gary at his home, but he denied ever knowing her. There was nothing until 2003 when he was finally arrested. When the cops got him, he admitted that during the original questioning in '83, he leaned against a fence to hide the scratches on his arm. Those scratches were left behind by Marie as she tried to escape. Number 6. Luxury vehicle theft spree. In Canada's biggest city, a luxury vehicle theft ring was just uncovered after 10 years of operation. According to the Toronto Police, working with officers in York, Niagara, Peel, and Halton, the crime spree saw dozens of the most expensive luxury vehicles be pulled out of people's driveways and sold for profit. The police finally cracked down on the thieves in Project Yellowbird. They conducted 30 raids across the Toronto area early on a Thursday morning, arresting 8 people in connection to approximately 150 theft charges. But as more and more stolen property is being discovered, the charges are going up and up. The thieves were targeting houses in rich neighborhoods with expensive vehicles. The people involved knew exactly what they were doing. The police raided 8 residences, 1 business, several storage lockers, and even a cargo container. The container had 2 stolen cars in it when they searched it. And considering these guys had been operating for decades already, the Canadian police probably don't have a clue how many actual thefts took place. They recovered 23 vehicles so far in connection to the thieves, but those were just the vehicles they hadn't sold yet. If they had 23 luxury cars ready to go when they were arrested, just imagine how many they shipped out over the last decade. Number 5. Harold Shipman. Harold Shipman was the worst serial killer in the history of the United Kingdom. He attended the Leeds School of Medicine and started working as a physician in the year 1970. Over the next 28 years, he killed no less than 215 of his patients. However, the real number could be as high as 260. He killed them with a lethal injection of painkillers. Harold was inspired to go to medical school after he watched his mother slowly die from terminal lung cancer. She passed away in 1963, and 7 years later, he graduated. By 1974, he was married to a woman named Primrose and had 2 children with her. He also had his very own medical practice and was thriving as a family practitioner. But he was caught in 1975 forging prescriptions for painkillers to feed his own addiction. He entered a drug rehab program and a few years later was working as a doctor at Donnybrook Medical Center. He worked at the hospital for nearly 2 decades, but at some point, the local undertaker noticed that many of his patients were dying. He also noticed they were all dying nearly the same way. The undertaker approached Harold, and so too did one of his medical colleagues who stumbled upon the same thing. The police got involved, but Harold was ultimately cleared of any wrongdoing. It wasn't until much later when he was under suspicion again that it came out he was altering the medication records of his patients. When he was finally apprehended, there was no way for investigators to know exactly how many people he killed. He's been doing it ever since he was a doctor. Harold never cooperated with authorities. He denied every accusation, and they could only charge him with a total of 15 murders. Up until his death in 2004, he never said a word about why he killed all those people. Why do you think Harold did it? Let us know your theories in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe before the end of the video. Number 4. La Grella. For decades, the crime squad in Paris was haunted by the atrocities committed by a notorious, unidentified serial killer. Starting in 1986, Paris became the playground for an unknown psychopath. He started killing and didn't stop until the 1990s. But it wasn't until 35 years later that the Paris police finally identified their man. His name is François Verove, but the French call him Le Grilla. It translates to the pockmarked man. One of his first victims was arguably his most shocking crime. Cecile Bach was reported missing after she failed to show up to school in 1986. The girl was only 11 years old. What her parents didn't know at the time was that the pockmarked man had gotten a hold of her on her way to class and then brutally ripped her to shreds like a mad werewolf. But this was only one of his murders. He has now, thanks to DNA evidence, been linked to at least 4 in total. Yet according to Didier Saban, the lawyer representing the families of the victims, he is probably responsible for a lot more. His DNA only connects him to murders up until 1994. Theoretically, he could have kept on killing, but they finally caught up to him in 2021. He could have gotten a lot better at hiding his DNA. But because he's dead now, we'll never know the true tale of his crimes. Number 3. Todd Kab. Todd Kab was born in Florida in 1971. His parents divorced when he was only 2. His mother married a new man, and Todd had a rather unhealthy relationship with the new husband. Todd became a troublesome child. He was aggressive to other children as early as nursery school. By the age of 9, he was so explosively violent that he had to undergo counseling. Before he was even 10, he became obsessed with sexual content. He was cruel to animals, caught murdering a goldfish and shooting at dogs with a BB gun. In other words, he was a troubled psychopath from the very beginning. His mother and stepfather separated in 1983, and Todd went to live with his biological father in Arizona. He started collecting weapons, he learned how to make bombs, and he continued signs of being a generally unstable and violent person. On November 25, 1986, when Todd was only 15 years old, he kidnapped a 14-year-old girl. He took her back to his house, tied her up, and assaulted her. He then walked her home as if he were a gentleman, though he did threaten to kill her family if she told anybody what he did. She told on him anyway, and he was charged with kidnapping. In 1987, Todd was sentenced to 15 years in prison. He was found to have borderline personality disorder and an IQ of way above average. A judge deemed him unlikely to be rehabilitated. He was let out in August of 2001 after serving 14 years. He graduated from the University of South Carolina with a Bachelor's of Science degree in 2008. On the outside, he looked quite successful. He had a real estate license. He built an entire real estate firm and had his own employees, and he even managed to get a private pilot license. He was also quite wealthy. Unbeknownst to those around him, he started killing almost immediately when he was let out of jail. In 2003, he walked into a motorcycle shop and shot 4 people for no reason. In 2016, Todd attacked 2 people who were sent to clear his house. The police found Charles Carver dead on Todd's property, then Kala Brown chained up to a wall in a metal storage container. Todd was arrested immediately. An additional search of his property revealed 2 more bodies identified as a husband and wife who had gone missing in 2015. Between 2003 and 2016, he killed a confirmed 8 people. How many more is still unknown. Number 2. Lonnie David Franklin Jr. Lonnie David Franklin Jr. preyed on the women of Los Angeles for more than 2 decades. On a warm Saturday evening in 2020, he was discovered unresponsive in his cell. He was pronounced dead just before 8 p.m. But if anything, his death came just a little earlier than expected. He was already sitting on death row for murdering a total of 10 people from between 1985 to 2007. Lonnie Franklin was one of the most prolific killers in California. Like many other serial killers, he targeted young and vulnerable victims. He was actually quite similar to Samuel Little. He targeted the poor and the destitute, which allowed him to fly under the radar as he went on killing. Plus, this was due to the crack epidemic of the 80s, when it seemed everywhere you looked in California, people were dying from drug overdoses. During his trial, prosecutors were able to connect him to all 10 slayings, but detectives say he probably killed upwards of 15 more women. And number 1, Robert Hansen. Robert Hansen spent the 1970s hunting women in the Alaska wilderness as if they were wild deer. He's known these days as the Butcher Baker. He was convicted in 1984 after confessing to murdering 17 women. During a crime spree that went on for 12 years, he picked off dancers and prostitutes while assaulting at least an additional 30 women, but not killing them. He was convicted for 4 of the murders, then handed a sentence of 461 years in prison. Sadly, Robert didn't spend almost 5 centuries suffering in jail. He died in 2014 at the age of 75 of seemingly natural causes. There's a movie about Robert Hansen called The Frozen Ground. It stars John Cusack, Nicolas Cage, and Vanessa Hudgens. Have you seen it?
8. One dead shark. A group of visitors recently dragged a shark out of the water to take pictures with it, which is honestly such a cruel thing to do. And because it was out of the water for so long, it caused the shark to suffocate and die. It happened at the Hard Rock Hotel and Casino in Punta Cana. The tourist and some staff worked together to capture the shark in the shallow water and haul it back onto the shore. It was pretty big, taking 7 men to hold the thing down, at least until it stopped moving. What happened here is something uniquely human. The shark was pinned down, a life preserver was shoved into its mouth, and it lay helpless as flocks of tourists came up and took photos with it. By the time the humans got bored, the shark was already dead. The poor thing suffocated outside the water for one of the cringiest photo shoots in beach history. 7. Violence in the streets. The streets of the Dominican Republic are just as dangerous as the hotels, especially in the city of Higüey. It was here that a man named Anielo Santana shot his wife, stole a woman's car at gunpoint, then went on an insane shooting spree. He killed 7 people, wounded 8, and was ultimately shot dead by the cops. According to the local police in the Dominican Republic, it all happened because of an argument. Anielo had gone into the home of Angela Acosta, his estranged wife. Whatever they got into an argument about was so severe that Anielo snapped and went completely crazy. He shot his wife, then decided to play some real-world Grand Theft Auto. Once he carjacked the woman on the street and started driving, he wanted to see how many people he could shoot dead before the cops finally got him. First, he barged into a cell phone store and shot a 21-year-old woman and her teenage brother. They had been shopping for a Father's Day present. Anielo then went on blasting random people until the cops finally cornered him. There was a brief firefight and Anielo was taken away in a body bag. 6. One dead expat. Lindsay De Felice, a British author living in the Dominican Republic, was discovered dead. Her decayed corpse was uncovered in a shallow grave in 2019. She'd been murdered by strangulation and left in the forest. All these years later, we still don't know who did it. It's taken until 2022 to get her husband of 14 years, his 2 sons, and a 4th man brought to trial for her death. Prosecutors say these men worked together to murder the 64-year-old woman. However, they've all pleaded not guilty, and we're still waiting for their day in court. Lindsay's story starts in 2002. She had lived a very successful life in the UK as a marketing manager, but she wanted something different. In 2002, she abandoned her husband, quit her job, and moved to the Maldives to scuba dive. She ended up settling in the Dominican Republic, getting a job as a scuba instructor, and marrying a local in 2005. She supported this man financially and even tried to get him elected as mayor. When Lindsay was shot in 2006 through the throat during a robbery gone bad, things took a dark turn. She couldn't scuba dive anymore and started writing instead. She wrote a book that reached #1 on the book charts, and now she's dead. Her husband has been accused of the murder, conspiring with his family to get rid of Lindsay and keep her money for themselves. Would you ever consider relocating to the Dominican Republic permanently after hearing about the sad case of Lindsay De Felice? Let us know in the comments why or why not, and don't forget to hit subscribe before the end of the video. 5. Crash landing. In 2021, 9 people tragically died in a terrifying plane crash in the Dominican Republic. The private plane had to make an emergency landing when something went wrong, but the landing went wrong too. 7 passengers and 2 of the crew were brutally killed when the plane crashed down at Las Americas Airport in Santo Domingo. That was everyone on board. Among the dead was the famous Puerto Rican music producer Jose A. Hernandez, also known as Flo La Movie. It's not clear what went wrong. The plane had taken off from La Isabela International Airport and was on its way to Florida when it ran into issues just 15 minutes after taking off. 4. Left for dead. A woman from Delaware had the worst vacation of her life when she was brutally attacked in the Dominican Republic. Not only was Tammy Lawrence Daly attacked violently, but she was severely injured mentally. She'll never forget the night she was beaten, violated, and locked in an underground dungeon. As Tammy was going to grab a snack, a man rammed her from behind, knocked her to the ground, and dragged her into an underground room. Once he had her inside the waist area, beneath where hundreds of vacationers were falling asleep or partying into the night, he tortured her. He kicked her, he beat her with a club, and he did other, even more heinous stuff as well. He choked her, strangled her, and left her to die. From here, things were pretty bleak for Tammy. She was injured beyond the ability to move. The bones in her face had been crushed. She slipped in and out of consciousness and was only found 8 hours later by her family and friends. Her family had needed to convince the hotel staff she was missing for them to actually start looking across their property. Tammy spent 5 days in the hospital, had to go through several surgeries, and her attacker was never found. 3. Human smuggling ring. The Dominican Republic may be famous for its beautiful beaches and hot weather, but it's also famous for its human smuggling. Authorities recently dismantled a massive criminal network involved in smuggling human beings at $20,000 per person. These human smugglers were involved in trying to bring 3 Dominican nationals into the U.S. The 3 Dominicans were among 56 other migrants killed when a truck bound for the U.S. crashed in Mexico. Security forces launched raids in the cities of Bani and Santo Domingo, arresting nearly a dozen people. These individuals were charged in the illicit trafficking of human beings, according to the Attorney General's office. But amazingly, prosecutors only requested jail sentences of 18 months each. This means that in less than 2 years, they'll probably be right back smuggling again. They used the money they made bringing people from the Dominican to the U.S. to buy luxury vehicles and real estate. Here's how they got the people from one point to the other. They would put the migrants on flights from the Dominican Republic to somewhere like Guatemala, Panama, or Mexico. They were then put inside freight containers and hauled across the land border into the U.S. Once inside, they were freed from the containers to go about their business. As for that truck accident I talked about earlier, it was really what forced the security forces in the Dominican Republic to crack down on the smugglers. The speeding tractor-trailer hauling a container full of migrants hit a pedestrian bridge on a highway and flipped over. Migrants were shot across the pavement, while some became trapped in the twisted metal. A total of 107 migrants, all of who were trying to sneak into the U.S. across the border, were injured. Among those seeking refuge in the United States were nationals of Guatemala, Colombia, and the Dominican. 2. A mysterious collapse. Galina Isayeva was 53 years old and healthy as a horse. She didn't have a thing wrong with her. She was as spry as a teenager, and yet she dropped dead in late April while vacationing in the Dominican Republic. Her husband told investigators he doesn't believe for a second that she simply collapsed, and yet that's what the Dominican authorities are saying. They say Galina collapsed from a pulmonary edema, which is a buildup of fluid in the lungs. She had been enjoying her vacation, everything was totally normal, and then she collapsed, stopped breathing, and was dead. Nobody knows what happened to Galina. Some have blamed dangerous pesticides in the air conditioning. Some say she could have been exposed to tainted alcohol. There definitely wasn't any evidence of violence, at least not physically. So far as the authorities can tell, she died from natural causes. But her family doesn't think so. They believe her death to be a mystery likely being covered up by the hotel she was staying at and the Dominican authorities. Her family believes the cover-up is a desperate attempt to protect the country's reputation as a tourism destination. 1. Surgical complications. A mother of 2 from New York City wanted to look even better than she already did. She was working as a nurse and a makeup artist in the city when she decided to get some plastic surgery done. She couldn't afford to do it in the U.S., so she booked the procedure in the Dominican Republic. But after she traveled to the Caribbean island to get liposuction on her buttocks, she ended up in a coffin. Her name was Jesme Tapia, just 30 years old. She had to be hospitalized at a local medical facility in the Dominican Republic because of an infection after the operation. They put her under observation in the intensive care unit, but she quickly passed away. We don't actually know all the complicated details surrounding the case. Her family has kept extremely quiet and denied the accusations that she had also been in the Dominican to undergo breast augmentation surgery. The family also haven't given any information on which facility Jesme paid to have the procedure done. If you or someone you know has been thinking of getting surgery done in the Dominican Republic, this should be a really strong wake-up call. Researchers at the University of Texas Medical Branch released a report in 2019. The report showed irrefutable evidence that the Dominican Republic is one of the most dangerous places to have plastic surgery done. The study found that doctors are not properly qualified, clinics don't adhere to safety guidelines, and dozens of people end up dying from complications. How do you feel about taking a vacation to the Dominican Republic after hearing these horror stories? Let us know in the comments, and thanks so much for watching. If you haven't yet, be sure to hit subscribe. Support the channel, and I'll see you again for another awesome video. Bye.